Youthlaw is a statewide specialist community legal centre that provides free legal assistance and information to young people under the age of 25 across Victoria. We're pretty unique in that we try to work with young people in looking at systemic issues that affect them, and we also work from a human rights-based framework. Youthlaw differs from Legal Aid in that we're an independent, not-for-profit organisation. So we're independent from government and we're community-based, and that's pretty important because what we try and do is respond to young people's legal needs, and we also provide a range of services. So that includes legal assistance, legal information, but it also includes providing community education to young people and also working with young people in other law reform issues. So Youthlaw and YRIPP have had a really long relationship, a productive relationship in bringing together the YRIPP program. So we provide the legal support and training to YRIPP volunteers. So when you do sign up for the program, you go through an induction process and we provide the legal training to give you the basics and the premise of young people's rights in the youth justice system and their rights in dealing with police and police interviews. YRIPP's an incredibly important program because it's a mechanism that helps enshrine the rights of young people, particularly when you're looking at young people who are vulnerable in a police station that are being interviewed by police. YRIPP volunteers are an integral part in making sure that a young person's rights are being enshrined in the police station so that they understand their rights, and they're also protected from any undue harassment or undue questioning by police.
Katrina, thanks so much for coming and speaking about YRIPP and Youthlaw. I'm just wondering if you could clarify some of the legal terms and the acts that are so important for YRIPP volunteers to know about. First of all, I'm wondering about CROC. I know CROC is a really important acronym for both YRIPP and Youthlaw, and I'm just wondering what it stands for. I always think of crocodile, and I know CROC definitely has teeth.
Thanks, Parla. Well, CROC definitely has some teeth. It's not a crocodile though. It stands for the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it's incredibly important because it brings together children's human rights that are articulated in other places.
Great. And Australia has chosen to, what's the word? Adopt CROC.
Yeah, that's right. So Australia has chosen to ratify CROC. So as a signatory to CROC, Australia has a responsibility to ensure that the rights of children and young people are recognised and upheld. So really it provides us with a set of guiding principles, and it's a legal and policy reference for government policymakers and those working with young people.
And in terms of the law, the young people that YRIPP supports, even though we call them young people, they're still considered children, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. In the CROC, they define a child as a young person who's under the age of 18.
Which CROC principles actually directly relate to YRIPP?
There are a few different principles from CROC that apply or relate directly to YRIPP. They're known as particular articles, so I'm just going to go through them one by one. The first one is Article 3. Article 3 says that in dealing with children, whether it be in courts or whether in making decisions by government bodies, the best interests of the child will be a primary consideration. Article 12, I think, is a really important article. It says that a child has a right to express their opinion freely and to have that opinion taken into account in any matter or procedure that affects them. So for me, that's a really important one because it articulates that young people have a right to actually say what they feel and have an opinion and have that to be taken into account, particularly in matters that affect them. Article 13 is also a similar one. It says that a young person has a right to express his or her views and obtain information and make ideas or information known regardless of any barriers.
I think the next one is Article 37.
So Article 37 is quite an important one in the context of YRIPP. So it looks at detention and punishment. So what Article 37 pretty much says is that no one is allowed to punish a young person in a cruel or harmful way. It recognises that young people who break the law should not be put in prison with adults. They should be kept in contact with their families. They should not be sentenced to death without possibility of release. So it's really looking at principles of how you deal with young people in the criminal justice system. Article 40 is also a really important one in the youth justice field. It says that young people who are accused of breaking the law have the right to legal help and fair treatment in a system that respects their rights. It also ensures that governments are required to set a minimum age below which children cannot be held criminally responsible, and to provide minimum guarantees for fairness and the quick resolution of proceedings in court. So an example of this is in Victoria, a young person has to be at least 10 years of age before they can be charged with a criminal offence.
So interestingly, there are now only 2 countries in the world that haven't ratified the CROC, America and Somalia. Katrina, I'm wondering if you could tell us about the Charter in the context of YRIPP. So it's kind of amazing that YRIPP is a program in Australia that's unique to Victoria, and isn't Victoria also the only state in Australia to actually have a human rights charter?
Yes, that's right. In Victoria, we're very lucky to have a piece of legislation called the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. What the Charter does is that it makes the Victorian Government, and this includes Victoria Police, to act compatibly with human rights, including the rights of children and young people. It means that the government has to consider human rights when they're developing policies, when they're making laws, and in delivering services and making decisions.
So what's the basic rundown on human rights? How are they actually defined by the Charter?
Well, human rights are basic entitlements that belong to all of us as human beings, regardless of our background, our age, what we look like, or what we believe in. They're based on values of equality, respect and dignity, and acknowledge the fundamental worth of each person. They're basic standards without which we would not be able to survive and develop in dignity. They're inherent to a human person, and they apply to all age groups.
And children are no different.
Children have the same human rights as adults, but because they are particularly vulnerable, they have particular rights that recognise their special need for protection.
And I'm guessing that they'd have particular rights in detention and in court.
Yes, absolutely. So there are some sections of the Charter that relate directly to young people who have been arrested by police, and particular sections that deal with young people who go through the court process. I'm going to go through some of those sections now. The most important one is section 23 of the Charter, and that says a young person who is detained must be separated from all detained adults. Another important one says that a young person must be brought to trial as quickly as possible. And another important one is that a young person who's been convicted of an offence must be treated in a way that is appropriate for his or her age. So it's really making a point about rehabilitation being the primary consideration when dealing with young people in the criminal justice system, and not looking at other aims or sentencing principles that might apply for adults, such as deterrence and punishment. It's really recognising that young people are different, they're vulnerable, and they should be given another opportunity to be dealt with in a as quick as possible a way in the court system, and have the opportunity to be rehabilitated.
So in a sense, would you say that actually the Human Rights Charter it's like a practical, localised interpretation of CROC, because really it's extremely similar principles, isn't it?
That's right. So what the Charter has done is pull together the principles that are outlined in CROC and actually put them in legislation in Australia. So that actually gives it some force in Australia, which is a really important thing. This doesn't exist in other states, so it's really important that we have a charter that recognises those particular principles.
So I'm just thinking in terms of the rights of the child and what you've just said about the Charter, it must be really important that young people give their actual age so that they receive fair treatment at the hands of the police, because otherwise, how are the police going to know that they have those extra rights?
That's right. So if you're a young person under the age of 18, giving your date of birth is a really good idea, because you do have additional rights. And for some young people, they are quite reluctant to share those details with police. And it is important, I think, as advocates or people who work with young people, to explain that as a young person under the age of 18, you are considered vulnerable and you have extra protections to other people in the criminal justice system.
And I'm just wondering, how much do the police know about the Charter? And because obviously they've got an obligation to follow the Charter.
Well, police are a government agency, so to speak. They must ensure that their procedures are compatible with human rights. They must also consider human rights in decision-making processes. Not doing so will be considered unlawful unless they could reasonably have acted differently. And that can be sometimes really difficult to apply in practice, as I'm sure a lot of people, a lot of YRIPP volunteers are thinking. What it does make clear for us is that police are accountable. So if the YRIPP volunteer does see that a police officer in interviewing a young person hasn't been respectful to the young person, that is something to be noted down, and it's something that they can bring to the attention of a senior officer, because it is something that they haven't conducted themselves in a professional manner, but it also means that they haven't conducted themselves compatibly with the Charter of Human Rights.
I think that is rather ambiguous, isn't it? They could not reasonably have acted differently.
Yes, that's right. I think the important thing though is to recognise that we do have a piece of legislation that does specifically look at the rights of young people and highlight that government agencies have a responsibility to act compatibly with the human rights of young people. And as long as we've got an instrument there that holds police accountable, then we're definitely a step in the right direction.
Katrina, in addition to CROC and the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, are there any specific Victorian laws that relate to YRIPP?
Yes, there are two important laws that YRIPP volunteers should know about. The first one is the Crimes Act of 1958 and the Children, Youth and Families Act of 2005.
And how are each of these important?
The Crimes Act sets out crimes, police investigation powers with respect to crimes committed and the rights of offenders during the investigation and the charge process in Victoria. The Children, Youth and Families Act is a particular piece of legislation that governs how the Children's Court operates and how the court is to process young people under the age of 18 once they are charged and go through the court system. It also sets out the sentencing principles and options available to a magistrate when a young person is found guilty of an offence.
So how do CROC and the Charter, the Crimes Act and the Children, Youth and Family Act practically affect what happens after a young person has been arrested?
Well, they all work together and translate in a practical sense into what we call caution rights. There are generally 8 caution rights that are essential for a young person at the police station. The first caution right is that a young person has a right to refuse to answer police questions or to say no comment. This actually comes from the Charter under section 25(2) subsection K, which states that a person is not compelled to testify against himself to confess their guilt.
But that's surely not unique to Victoria, is it? I mean, everyone says no comment in the movies.
Yes, that's right. This is an old principle that's been established in common law for a very long time. It's also referred to in the Crimes Act.
So do you think most young people would actually know about this right then?
I think some of them do from watching some television shows, but I don't know if they necessarily know it's a right that exists for them in Victoria. It really helps if a young person knows clearly that they don't have to give any information or take part in an interview. And it's also important for a young person to know that it doesn't necessarily help them if they say no comment to some questions but then answer a few other questions. It can look quite ambiguous. We recommend that if they're going to give a no comment interview, they should do so across the board at all times.
Are there actually any questions that you have to answer? Presumably you have to answer that you understand the caution. Is there anything else?
It's an offence to refuse to give your name and address or to give a false name and address.
And the second caution right?
So the second and third caution rights relate to communication. It says that a young person has a right to contact a friend or relative in private to let them know where they are, and they also have a right to try and obtain legal advice in private.
What if the young person is actually a citizen of another country? Does this give them any different or special rights?
Caution right number 4 relates to this. If you are a young person who's a citizen of another country, you do have the option of getting additional support and having the right to communicate with their consulate office. So this is also contained in the Crimes Act.
So Katrina, where do parents and guardians and the independent person fit into all of this?
So parents, guardians and independent persons all fit into a particular section of the Crimes Act that relate to young people under the age of 18. So that's section 464E of the Crimes Act. What that section says is that if a young person is in custody, then they have a right to be able to communicate with an adult, being their parent or guardian, before any questioning takes place. This also includes the independent person. The other really important thing, which is most relevant to the YRIPP program, is that section 464E provides a mechanism where police cannot interview a young person unless a parent, guardian or independent person is present. And that is the whole reason why the YRIPP program exists.
And what happens if a young person doesn't speak fluent English?
Caution right 6 is relevant here. If a young person doesn't speak fluent English or doesn't understand English, they have a right to use an interpreter if necessary, and specialised communication tools are required. This is enshrined in both the Crimes Act and in the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities.
Another thing everyone is familiar with from crime shows are mugshots, ID lineups. Do young people have to participate in these?
No, they do not. So it's very similar to their right to stay silent. A young person has a right to refuse to be photographed or participate in an ID lineup.
And what's the deal with forensic procedures? What are they exactly?
Forensic procedures are applications by police to try and get some forensic material. So forensic material include hair, skin, body fluids. They're quite invasive procedures as police have to take a sample of them. Caution right 8 states that a person has a right to refuse consent to a forensic procedure and have a court decide whether this is necessary.
So a forensic procedure would take a while to get happening, I'm assuming.
Absolutely, and for young people, police actually have to apply to the Children's Court for an order to get a forensic sample. Once this is obtained, they can then use reasonable force to obtain a sample, but the important thing to realise is that young people cannot consent to a forensic procedure by the police.
How about fingerprints? There seems to be a bit of confusion around who actually has to give them and in what circumstances.
Yes, it can be quite confusing because it does depend entirely on age. So the police cannot fingerprint a person of 14 years or under. In this situation, they must get consent from both the young person and their parent or guardian. If this consent is refused, then a court order is required to override this. If the police do fingerprint a person who is 14 years or younger, then the independent person should draw this to the attention of the section sergeant. It's important to note that an independent person cannot give consent to fingerprinting.
Katrina, can you just clarify the issue of fingerprints with young people 15 and over? Because I think it's quite a different scenario.
It is, it's very different. If you're a young person who's 15 years old or over, then you can be fingerprinted by the police if they think that you have committed a serious criminal offence. But in taking those fingerprints, there are a few things they have to let a young person know. So some of these things include why they're taking the fingerprints and what they're going to be used for, and more importantly, the offence that they believe the young person has committed.
So actually, at that point, if the police want the fingerprints, the young person does not have a right of refusal. Is that correct?
Generally not, as long as they believe that you have committed a serious criminal offence, and you can presume that if they've arrested a young person and want them for questioning, that there is that component fulfilled. What's important is that if a young person over the age of 15 is asked for their fingerprints, then it has to be taken in the presence of an adult.
So I'm guessing that's where the YRIPP IP would come in?
Yes, that's correct. The other things that police must make sure they tell a young person when they do take the fingerprints is that if within 6 months they haven't charged them, then the fingerprints have to be destroyed. If the young person is found not guilty in court later on down the track, then those fingerprints must be also destroyed.
So I'm guessing that really it's incredibly important for YRIPP independent persons to be vigilant the entire time and not just to roll with the process, but in terms of the legal perspective to remain very mindful and observant.
Absolutely. Being an independent person is not a passive role. You're really there to advocate on behalf of the young person, bearing in mind that you're working with young people who are quite vulnerable, who aren't necessarily very articulate in terms of expressing what their rights are, any concerns. Independent people are in a prime position to be able to take notes and be able to enshrine a young person's rights. So a perfect example is, like I said before, when they do observe that police have been untoward towards a young person. So that could be either by the way or manner in which they're talking to them, or if they've breached or broken any of the rules that we've talked about earlier today. And what they should do is try and raise it with that senior sergeant in the police station, and always keep very good notes about what happened, because that may lead to the young person being able to make a complaint against the police at some later stage in the proceedings. Those notes are also very important because they can be used as evidence in the children's court later on down the track if there's any allegation about the unfair use of evidence by police.
So Katrina, just in summing up young people and the law within the context of YRIPP, the YRIPP program, what are some other things that the YRIPP independent person should be mindful of as part of their role?
I guess what I would really stress to YRIPP volunteers is your role is there as an observer and also to advocate on behalf of the young person when you feel that their rights are being limited. So some other things that you might want to consider when you meet that young person in the police station is to see how they are emotionally. So if they're visually upset, if they present as being upset or frustrated during the interview process, then you are able to intervene and ask for some time out from the police officer, because you can see that the young person is quite upset, and that's absolutely fine to do that. Break for 5-10 minutes, check that the young person is okay, and then resume the police interview. Other things to keep an eye out on as well is to see if the young person has any medical needs. So there'll be some occasions where a young person you might meet might have some injury. So that could be some scratches to the face. They might have some other indications of an assault, say a black eye or anything like that. It's really important for you to be able to check in with that young person and make as many notes as you can consistent with the injuries that they might present with. And the other thing that I would just keep an eye out on is, again, the manner in which police speak to the young person, bearing in mind the rights that are involved in young people and the police having to act compatibly with human rights. So if you do feel that the questioning is a little bit untoward, a bit pushy, then by all means feel free to stop the police officer and ask them to rephrase the question. It is important to note that you're not meant to be there though to stop the questioning or to try and answer the questions on the young person's behalf. You're merely there to check that the young person is okay, see that they're comfortable in that interview situation to make sure that their rights aren't being impinged upon.
Thanks for your time, Katrina. That's fantastic.
Thank you, Paula, and good luck to all you YRIPPers.